So this week we're talking about focus groups. So let's have a quick conversation about what they are. In our list of 10 things, we're still in the getting the data space. So this is a way of getting data. So far we've actually had, So far we've actually had a lot of individual ways of getting data. So interviews are one-on-one, discourse analysis, you know, you're reading texts written by one person, sometimes a committee, but you know, it's an entity, it's a singularity. Ethnography, you're observing one, but in many, but you know, you're observing the ones and things like this. This, we're actually putting people together in a focus group to get data on a collective way, if that makes sense. I wanted to emphasise the difference between focus groups and group interviews. I have done this before when we were doing interviews and group interviews. The difference is fundamentally, one is about exploratory type approaches and what do people really think, whereas a group interview is literally an interview which will be semi-structured or structured, and you will ask each person the questions. Okay, so you're in a group, so it's often done, we often do group interviews with people who have a connection. So you know, you might interview a family group, or you might interview work colleagues or things like that. So you're asking them the same sort of questions, but you're asking them in front of other people to get a certain response to see whether there's agreement and whether there's slight discussion. But group interviews are heavily structured, okay? But a focus group is a lot more free-form. So we're actually getting two sets of data from them. This is why it's really important to understand that group interviews are more like focus groups and less like real interviews, but they're still kind of different from a focus group per se, if that makes sense. So there's nuances in them, okay? But you're still getting that whole thing of responses off each other. So that's where we're sitting. Good. All right, so this is a really nice way of presenting, and I've actually pinched this from Michael Walsh, and I didn't attribute it, that's my fault. So what you can see here is the difference between the interview, which is what you are doing in assessment D, and what a focus group. You can see here that we're using different language. In a focus group, you're no longer an interviewer, you are actually a moderator. And this is really important differentiation. As an interviewer, you're kind of controlling, manipulating, directing, you know, you're just driving in a certain direction. But as a moderator, you're throwing stuff out there to see what comes back. You're making sure everyone has a voice, and I'm going to talk about that later on. Okay, so it's a really different role. You are not a participant. In fact, ideally, if you can set and forget, as in throw out the first stimulus and then walk away, and just let the conversation go, that is the perfect focus group. Very rare, but you know, so because then you're not in it at all. Whereas in an interview, you will hear yourself on your transcript a lot. Okay, preferably not too much, but you will hear yourself. In a focus group, you shouldn't. So, and again, when we're looking at the interaction, I've just described that, you know, what in a focus group, it should be all the participants talking off each other. Think of your tutorials, okay? Your tutorials are kind of a focus group because it's about talking, having the discussion, sharing, all that sort of stuff. Oh, no, you think that, that's interesting, I don't think that. Okay, that's literally what a focus group is. One thing that can happen in focus groups is they can go completely off the rails and you'll end up with people very strongly disagreeing with each other. That never happens well, it can happen in an interview, but it's much rarer because that's not what we're after in an interview. In an interview, we're after them being comfortable and wanting to share their information with us. Okay, so we work at that rapport, you know, all that mimicry stuff that we were talking about in interview week. Whereas in a focus group, you're literally putting the stimulus material out there and then walking away. So all sorts of things can go wrong. All sorts of things can go right, but all sorts of things can go wrong. So that's worth thinking about as well. And here you've got the whole language thing. So because you're not asking specific questions, you're going to get different language. You also may get language that you don't understand. Okay, and you can't stop a focus group and say, oh, I'm sorry, I don't understand that word. You have to let that one go and then tag it for later on and go, better look that word up. All right, because you can't stop the flow. Once the flow is happening, you really don't want to get in there. Because that's the point of your research, right? Is that you're exploring. You want to see how other people think of your topic. I'm going to talk about rapport in a bit of detail later on, so I'm not going to go into too much detail here. Now, the interactions here, the thing that I like about focus groups is the physical things that you observe. So you don't just get what people are saying, you also see them react to other people. So you see somebody make a statement and somebody go, ooh, okay, and then that's really interesting data. So that then becomes data as well as what's being said. Okay, so I've only ever run one focus group in my life. I would never do it again, just quietly. Not my cup of tea. But people got really angry that they literally thumped the table. So it was kind of weird, but they were really passionate about it. And we didn't use the data that we got from that for publication. We used it to guide our research that we did for publication. All right, so it was a straight out exploratory thing because we didn't know whether or not the problem existed, and then we found out the problem really did exist in a table thumping manner. All right, and so that was really interesting data that we got. Sorry, let me check. The other thing is that with a focus group is that you won't necessarily do it by yourself. And in fact, you shouldn't be doing it by yourself. I'm going to talk a bit later on about how many you need to have in the room with you, but when I did it, we did it with 2 of us, and that wasn't enough as well. So that's good. All right, so what we did in our focus group is our stimulus material was actually, we started with post-it notes. So we gave them a few questions and they each had post-it notes to respond to. So the stimulus material we created in the room. And so then they wrote what they thought in the answer to the question, and then we started to group them under topics, under themes, if you like. And then we'd say, you know, the post-it note, and then say, well, we think it belongs in this theme, and then people would yell at us and say, no, it doesn't, or we'd have discussion, and then they'd all fight each other, and we'd just stand back and wait. All right? So we actually got the participants to create their own stimulus material based on our questions. What was interesting was once we'd done that, we didn't have to do anything else. Because once they'd written them down and we'd put them up, they literally just took over the whole room and just kept yelling at us a lot. Because they were very passionate about what we were talking about. So you've got to have that sort of stuff. As I said, the data that you get from a focus group, I'm personally of the position I wouldn't necessarily publish on it. But that's my personal position. People do. It's just that it's a real mixed bag, right? You'll get so much diversity in your data that I'm really not sure how you would draw it and argue it and present it. People do because they're very, very clever, but it's not my strength, so I'm not sure how you would have confidence in your responses, particularly if you ran 3 different focus groups and got 3 large different responses. Okay, so which you would do, I suspect. The other thing is that we don't tend to do really sensitive topics in focus groups. So we don't ask people how, you know, they feel about immigration in a focus group. Okay, because that's, you know, a very personal topic. It's a very volatile topic, particularly in this day and age. And you're more likely to end up with the biggest thing that happens in a focus group, you'll end up with somebody with a really dominant voice and everyone else will just sit there and watch. Okay? You guys have spoken to me, a couple of you, about there's some particular tutorials that you sit in where there'll be 2 dominant students and the rest of you just sit there going, well, they know the answer, so I'm done. That happens in focus groups, and if that happens in focus groups, as a moderator, you're not doing your job. You need to make sure everybody's voice is heard. It's a slide later on, I'll get into it. But you don't do sensitive topics because what happens is you get fisticuffs or whatever, so it's very hard to do. Having said that, You could quite happily do a group interview, possibly on a sensitive topic with people who knew each other. So, you know, if you had a group of people who had had a shared trauma or something like that and you wanted to do a bit of research on that, that may be a good way to do it because they're there to support one another. But they're not strangers, okay? A focus group is normally a bunch of strangers thrown together. A group interview would be a better condition to do something sensitive because they might know, you know, I would structure it so that they know each other to increase that degree of comfort. And a group interview is good for that type of thing because they're there to support and care, particularly afterwards, right? Because remember, after you walk out of the room, and this will happen with your interviews, after you walk out of your interview, the person you've just interviewed is still thinking about what you talked about. All right? Ideally, they're going to be thinking about it for 5 minutes. At worst, they're going to be thinking about it for the rest of their life. So you really don't, you know, you don't want to traumatise people who are vulnerable, okay? Now, this is a really good question about whether or not the data is actually valid. I've spoken a little about this, about whether I publish from it. If we take the technical word of valid, that the data has to answer the question, well then, if you've got a question that requires a focus group answer, then yes, your data's valid. I'm not very good at focus groups, so I don't really know how I'd do it. But it doesn't mean that it's wrong. Just because there's a lot of it and because it's messy and because it's not necessarily structured in any way and because it's physical as well as verbal, it doesn't make it not workable. It just makes it really very tricky to get clean, clear, credible, integrity, you know, all those sorts of words about it. All right, and I've already spoken about the physical research. You know, it's watching the actions. The actions are hysterical, okay, and that's where some of the data is. It's where, you know, it's when one person says that one phrase and everyone else in the room physically backs off them, that phrase, you know, is interesting, okay? Again, if somebody says something and everybody leans in, then you know that phrase is interesting, okay? So you're looking for the cues in the room. Okay, so the type of people that you want in there, it's exactly like any other research method, right? You've got to have a sample group, you've got to find the right people, you've got to find the right demographics. You know, if you want to run a focus group on phones or mobile phones, there's no point in having people in the room who don't use a mobile phone. You know, all this basic stuff. So you really want to be conscious of the type of sample that you've got. Now, you will have a dominant personality or personalities. Okay, it happens in every group, right? Think of all the tutorials they're in, including for this subject. You always have a person in the room or people in the room who are quite assertive on their opinions, right? They know what they want to say, they've got an idea, they're going to say it. But then on the other hand, you do have those students out there, or those people in your focus group, who have really awesome ideas, but they're not going to open their mouth. All right? They are what we call in the focus group the reluctant. So what we have to do is actually reach them and actually draw them in. So if you think about the tutorials at the beginning of the semester, I forced you guys to talk all the time. You know, I made you all talk, we go around the circle, you continue to talk. Even now, I'll pick on you if you haven't said something for a while. It's now a bit of a joke, and so you're all quite happy to have a chat. All right, I've built that up over weeks. In a focus group, you have to build that up in 10 minutes. Okay? But this is what you have to do. You have to make the room comfortable enough that that person who has something really good to say but isn't going to say it, you can draw out. Okay? And I'm going to talk about how you draw that out, I think, in another... Actually, no, I'll do it here. And it is actually literally like, oh, Sam, you actually haven't said anything for a while. Is there something you'd like to contribute at this point in time? And you actually draw them. You actually have to physically pick them. And they might say, no, I'm good. Okay, blah, 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 blah. You go on. And another 5 minutes, it's Sam, I'm going to pick on you. You know, Sam, just on this point, would you like to contribute? And by the time the third time, Sam's going to volunteer some information. Because he feels loved, okay? He feels safe. You've got to make a feeling of safety. So the most dangerous person in your focus group is that person who won't shut up. Because they will make the whole focus group feel unsafe. All right? And I don't mean unsafe as in, you know, oh, they're going to come at me with a knife. I just mean verbally unsafe. You know what I'm talking about? You've got those tutorials where somebody just won't shut up. Sometimes it's the tutor, right? You know? Anyway, Look, the other thing is that I like to put quotes in the lectures. You may have noticed this. I liked this because this, for me, is one of the problems with focus groups, is that they're a little too easy to manipulate to get to where you want it to go. Now, this is a bit cheeky, and I just liked it because, you know, I think political correctness in humour is becoming a problem, and is it stopping a lot of funny stuff. But this is the point, right, is that it is too easy to say we ran a focus group and we found out that blue chairs should never be used. What? Really? There was a group of people in the world who actually had an opinion on that, right? So, but you think about it, too often now you'll hear in media, oh, focus groups were run and it shows this. Focus groups were run and it shows that Australians want, you know, lower taxes. Okay, well, if we want lower taxes and we want more healthcare and more public education and more roads, that doesn't work mathematically, right? So which focus group are you running where? All right, so that's my fundamental question about focus groups. I think they're fundamentally flawed in many, many ways, but they're also good in many, many ways.